Okay. So in 3, 2, 1, count down from 10, all right?
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. On behalf of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and our co-hosts, I would like to thank you for joining us for the launch of a very special report that we hope will play a significant role in redressing one of the greatest power imbalances of our times, the disparity in pay between men and women at work. The report is called Gender Gap Reporting, a Comparative Analysis, and it was facilitated through Trust Law, the global pro bono legal service of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. The report is the result of a very effective and powerful collaboration between the Fawcett Society and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London and leading law firms Latham and Watkins, Castor and Snellman, and BBA Viatco, who examined hundreds of laws related to gender pay gap in 10 countries around the world. We all know that gender pay gap is an ongoing issue, one that corporates, civil society, and some governments have put high on the agenda, and one that has received significant media attention. But despite all that, progress to reduce the gender pay gap has been slow, in fact, too slow. Around the world, women earn on average 77 cents for every dollar that men earn by doing work of equal value. Even more worrying is the fact that the ILO believes that it will take 202 years for this gap to close unless urgent action is taken. Now, the World Economic Forum, the WEF, is much more optimistic as it puts the timeline at just 108 years. So if we go by these numbers, we will certainly have self-driving electric cars, very little energy dependence from fossil fuels, and cashless society before closing the gender gap. That clearly doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make any sense because this inequality is having a direct impact on half of the world's population, narrowing access to opportunities not only for women, but also for their families. Because as we know from the World Bank estimates, women reinvest up to 90% of what they earn into their immediate and extended families. In the United Kingdom, 2020 marks 50 years since the landmark legislation that enshrined equal pay in law. And despite the encouraging fact that in recent years, the gender pay gap has narrowed, particularly for the younger generations, the average gender gap among all women in terms of pay who are working in the UK stands at 17.3%. Now add to the mix COVID-19, which this year has killed more than 1 million people, devastating economies and widening inequalities. It's estimated that because of COVID, an additional 96 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty next year. Now, more than half of those 96 million people are women and girls. Women have been severely affected by this global health crisis. We all know, we've all seen it. They've been absorbing extra childcare and housework responsibilities. They lost their jobs in greater numbers than men. And sadly, many have suffered a considerable increase in domestic violence. This pandemic could really set women's economic progress back by half a century, undoing any progress that has been made in recent years. It is critical that we close this gap before it's too late. At the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we combine the power of journalism and the law to foster inclusive economies. We collaborate on new approaches with decision-making and taking efforts in building an economic model that fosters social justice by engaging key stakeholders such as businesses, the legal community, policymakers, civil society, and social enterprises. 50 years on from the UK Equal Pay Act, we are in dire need of a reset that will lead to a more just economy designed to work for everyone and for the long term. But without full transparency into the true nature of the gender pay gap in this country, the UK will only take faltering steps towards addressing gender parity. My hope is that this research does much more than just contribute to the narrative. My hope is that it becomes a pathway for accelerating progress towards addressing gender inequalities worldwide. In the past 24 hours, we got some great news from Spain, where the government has passed 2 decrees that will force Spanish companies with more than 50 employees to keep and disclose records of employees' salaries by gender. Now, failure to disclose the system used to establish both base salaries and all sorts of other benefits for their employees will trigger fines up to 187,000 euros. That's roughly 220,000 American dollars. Additionally, companies are now required to file a 4-year plan specifying exactly how they intend to balance their workforce female to male worker ratio in terms of selection and hiring process, but also work conditions, prevention of sexual harassment. Companies will have 6 months to comply with these decrees, and the minister in charge, Yolanda Diaz, said the gender pay gap is a democratic aberration that excludes, differentiates, and violates the rights of women. Well said. I'm delighted that the Thomson Reuters Foundation has been able to facilitate this work. I am very proud of the contribution my team has made, and I'm very grateful to the Fawcett Society and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London for leading this terrific work. And I am, of course, immensely grateful to Leighton and Watkins, Castron and Snellman, and BBA Viatco for their pro bono contribution to this very timely and important project. Now, let me hand this over to Laura Jones for what will certainly be a hugely compelling discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. My name is Laura Jones. I'm a research associate at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I'm going to be giving you a whistle-stop tour of some of the findings about the key findings of our research, before I hand over to the panel to reflect on them. So please bear with me just a moment. I'm just going to get some slides up on the screen. So I hope you should be able to see those. So as Antonio has mentioned, the goal of our project was to map international gender pay gap reporting legislation with the aim of highlighting best practice and reflecting on a way forward for the UK. We felt that now was a really good time to be doing this research. Broadly, there's cross-party agreement that the gender pay gap and gender equality in the workplace more broadly are important policy areas. But we are entering a profound period of uncertainty in the wake of the coronavirus crisis and as Britain leaves the EU. And so it felt like a good time to take stock of developments elsewhere. So as Antonio mentioned, the report covered 10 jurisdictions, including the UK, with some form of gender pay gap legislation. I'm not going to take you through the requirements for each country, but what I do want to highlight are some of the key themes that arose when we looked at them comparatively and pull out the differences with the UK. I'm going to be highlighting 2 areas where the UK seems to be out of step with current best practice, 2 where it's leading, and 1 area of opportunity moving forward. But first, a lightning speed reminder of the current situation in the UK. So UK-wide gender pay gap reporting was instituted into law in 2017, although duties on public sector bodies in Scotland and Wales predate this. When I talk about the UK legislation, I'm referring broadly to the legislation which applies to private sector employers nationally and public sector employers in England. So although the requirement to report was temporarily suspended this year due to the coronavirus crisis, the legislation applies to employers with at least 250 employees, and employers must provide 4 key pieces of information, including information on overall gender pay gap figures, the proportion of men and women in each of 4 bands, and information on bonuses. So moving on now to the results from our comparative analysis, I want to begin by highlighting 2 areas where the UK seems to be out of step. So when we looked across the piece, we found that the 250 employee threshold was pretty high. So you can see Sweden, for example, the legislation applies to employers with 10 or more employees. So that's pretty small, but the median employer size across all the countries we looked at was 50. Only Germany had a higher headcount threshold at 500 employees. When we look at the actual content of the reports, what employers need to submit, we found that broadly there are two different types of information that countries legislate for. So firstly, data on the remuneration and level of employees by gender. I don't want to go into too much detail on this here. You can read more about it in the report, because where we see the really key difference is in terms of the second type of information on workforce policies and action plans. So under the UK regulations, there's no requirement for employers to provide any information about the policies that they're putting in place to improve gender equality or to produce a corrective action plan. Employers do have the option of including a narrative of explaining their pay gaps and what actions they plan to take, but it's not mandatory. And the Government Equalities Office estimated that in 2018 and 19, around half of employers published a plan. In the majority of countries that we looked at in the report, this requirement is included in some form in the legislation. So in Australia, for example, employers are required to provide details on the availability and use of a range of different policies, including those related to recruitment, retention, flexible working, parental leave, and among others. In many other countries in Europe, there's a requirement not only to submit these information on these policies, but also an assessment of their impact. And Antonio has given us a quick overview of the new legislation on Spain, which includes such a requirement. In other countries, the requirement to produce an action plan is triggered under certain circumstances. And in many cases, then trade unions and other employee representative groups play a key role in determining the content of the plan. So in France, for example, failure to gain a certain score against a set of gender equality pay-related indicators triggers the requirement to include an action plan on the agenda for mandatory negotiations with trade unions. It's a similar story in Belgium, and in closer to home in Wales, for public sectors, for public sector employers, identify gender pay differences trigger a requirement to publish a statement, which is developed in consultation with interested parties such as employees and trade unions. So those are the two areas where the UK seems to be sort of slightly out of step. Moving on to the positives, I want to briefly highlight two areas where the UK gender pay gap legislation appears to be best in class. Firstly, when we look at compliance, 100% of eligible employers reported in 2019, although this is down massively in 2020 with the requirement to report dropped. And this contrasts with some really mixed compliance rates in other jurisdictions. Finally, in terms of transparency, in terms of how publicly available the information that is produced from the legislation, the UK again leads. So all the data from the reports is made publicly available, and that's generated many of the headlines that I know we will have seen, and also some of the pressure that many companies report feeling in order to really address their gender pay gaps. In other countries, things are more mixed. So in Australia, for example, pay gap information is available at an aggregated industry level rather than at an individual company level, taking some of that heat off. At the other extreme, in a few different other jurisdictions, gender pay gap reports are considered internal documents, and there are actually financial penalties for sharing those reports with a third party. So to summarize, we found two key areas where the UK seems to be out of step in terms of the high minimum employee threshold and no requirement to report on policies or action plans. Two, where the UK is leading in terms of high levels of compliance and transparency. And I want to finish with a final concluding thought in terms of an area of opportunity going forward. So while the focus of our report was on gender pay gap reporting, we did also ask the legal team to note whether any of the jurisdictions had reporting requirements with regard to other protected characteristics, and we didn't find any such examples. So in this respect, the UK has the opportunity to lead the world with the plans for ethnicity pay gap reporting that we consulted on in 2019. So those are the key findings in the report. I'm going to hand over to Julia now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. My name's Julia Gillard and I'm the chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I want to thank Laura for her presentation of this very interesting research and for all her work on it. And my thanks go to Antonio for setting the scene. And my thanks go to the Thomas Reuters Foundation, to Latham and Watkins, and to the Fawcett Society. It's my role this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world, to facilitate a panel discussion, and we are joined by some fantastic panellists for their reflections on this research work and on the gender pay gap. I'm going to introduce first Gillian Unsworth. Gillian is a very distinguished civil servant. At the moment, she is the head of gender pay gap reporting for the Government Equalities Office in the UK. And in that role, she leads the work which enables over 10,000 employers to publish their gender pay gap data each year. So Gillian, over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. And thank you for the report. It is incredibly helpful and really interesting reading. So I've been working on gender pay gap reporting from the start, and we've had a rollercoaster 3 years of reporting. The first year's deadline felt absolutely massive. It seems like a long time ago, back in 2018, when we had an incredible over 10,000 employers reporting, and 94% of those reported by the deadline. And on top of that, we had media interest from around the world. We're still waiting for our invite to go and speak to the local press in Hawaii, which I think was the most far-flung and most exciting bit of coverage. But that transparency that Laura picked up in her presentation, the availability of the information immediately meant that there was an unfolding soap opera which really grabbed people's attention and really helped put that pressure, again, that Laura referred to, on businesses to come up with an answer. And it was so extremely exciting. It was really great. But then we were left with this kind of, so what next? And I was agreeably surprised that actually employers it wasn't just that they were feeling pressure. There was a real appetite to go beyond reporting and actually do something. But there was a real lack of knowledge as to what they could do and what would actually work to close the gender pay gap. One thing that I did notice, there was a lot of action, particularly in the larger companies. They were putting a lot of money, a lot of resources into big programs to try and improve women's chances in the workplace. But in a lot of cases, they were quite misdirected. So, for instance, I had some great canapes going to lots of 10th anniversaries of women's networks, but still, these were for companies with horrendous gender pay gaps. So there was a real loud question coming from even some of the most advanced companies: what can we do? So what we did in the Government Equalities Office was we worked with Behavioural Insights team, looking at the evidence to show what steps employers could take that had got proven results to start closing the gender pay gap. And actually, there were some real surprises in that, because there are some really simple steps that employers can take that have got the low cost attached to them, but have a real impact. We also pointed out what doesn't work. And again, that's where we had some really clear surprises. So for instance, on the what doesn't work, women's leadership training courses do not help close the gender pay gap. They can be incredibly valuable for individual women, but they don't for the pay gap. And that's because a lot of the causes are not anything performance, it's the system that's broken. So if we continually focus all of our actions on fixing the women, because I'm not broken, I think that's one sweeping generalization I can apply to most women. We are not on the whole broken. It's the systems that are set. They were all created back in a really outdated workforce day, back in the 50s, when the man went to work, leaving the little wife at home, looking after the children. And all of those systems and processes were based around this kind of old boys network, which is hugely outdated, and we haven't updated those. So a lot of our steps are around transparency and getting employers to be more transparent about how people can progress, what expectations they can have in their career, and just making sure that everybody has an even playing field. So that's been kind of the focus of our work over the first 2 years, working with employers, getting these really simple steps into their thinking, and helping them to adapt to the needs of their organisation and to the needs of their industry as a whole as well. And it's been really fascinating unpicking all of the challenges that individual industries face, and working with some really powerful leaders across industries who really want to make a difference on this, and trying to work out where the challenges lie and how we address those. Unfortunately, this year has been a big surprise to everybody, and as Laura mentioned, the deadlines for this year's reporting fell right at the beginning of lockdown, and as part of the wider government aims to try and reduce the burden on business at what was a really terrifying time for, I think, most businesses, we took the difficult decision, along with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, to remove the enforcement of the gender pay gap regulations. So employers were still able to report, but there was no action. We took no action against the people who were unable to report by the deadline, or didn't report at all, recognising that there was challenging circumstances for everyone. So we were massively reassured, though, because almost 6,000 employers have still reported, which shows there is still that appetite. But we're in a very challenging situation now, looking at what we do next. Had this been normal times, our aim was that after the third year's deadline, that we'd take stock, work out where we set off next, and really start to push even harder for targeted action with employers. But the world has been flipped on its head. We are working across government to try and take look at the impacts and the inequalities that the pandemic has exposed, look at those and try to work out where we can build back better, and to make sure that tackling those inequalities is very much at the heart of that building back. So I'm afraid I can't give any great revelations on what we're going to be doing next, because we're still at the heart of that sort of planning process. But I can assure you that this goes right to the top, and we certainly are getting interest across government on how we can integrate equalities into everything that we do, and really push to make sure that equalities don't get lost in a real driver for change as we emerge from the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and thank you particularly for the reminder that it's most definitely not women who are broken, it's women who are campaigning for their rights. And on the theme of campaigning for rights, I'm going to turn now to Shavana Taj. Shavana is the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress in Wales, a position that she's held since 2013. And prior to that, she was a representative of the Public and Commercial Services Union. Shavana, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. The gender pay gap, as has already been mentioned, is closing at a snail's pace. It currently stands at 17.3, down a fraction from 17.9% in 2019. And for us, that means that the average woman effectively works for free for 2 months of the year compared to the average man. And that's according to TUC analysis that was published earlier this year. We know that Black women in particular face significant ethnicity pay gaps, as do female disabled workers. Disabled women face the highest pay gap, 25.9%, compared to non-disabled men. And as previous panelists have already mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis is actually intensifying the pre-existing inequalities we already know about. TUC analysis of the ONS figures recently have shown that women have experienced a 79% increase in redundancies between April and June compared with the previous quarter. And in contrast, men have experienced an increase of 23% for the same period. Many of the sectors in which a large proportion of women work, such as retail and hospitality, have been hit hard, with other sectors such as health and beauty being really slow to reopen during the pandemic, whilst the arts and music venues and that sector in particular not having had the opportunity to reopen their doors at all. Many of these sectors have not received any sort of targeted, dedicated government support to help them have any sort of real chance of survival to date. And although here in Wales, we have done things slightly differently, and we've been working in social partnership with our Welsh Government, business and unions, to target some of the support that we can provide here. And we have managed to negotiate a small one-off payment of support for freelancers and the self-employed. Again, a large, significant number of women are freelancers and self-employed. There's also, we've been seeing the practice of fire and rehire on worse terms and conditions, and we've seen some of this happening in companies, well-known companies such as BA and Centrica, a firm that's owned by British Gas. And actions like this only do one thing, and that is to further existing gender pay gaps. And we feel that if the UK government now fails to take any meaningful action to tackle institutional and structural inequality, we could see a worsening of the gender pay gap and a reversal of the decades of progress women have made in the labour market. Many people have been talking a good talk about the need for a feminist economic recovery, but what does that actually mean in practice, and how does that change things for those who are most impacted and left behind? A real recovery plan needs to be equitable, fair, green, just, and intersectional. It needs to have the voices and lived experiences of all women at the front and centre, particularly BME women, who are often spoken about but are not a visible part of the story. Here in Wales, as has been mentioned, public sector organisations are required by law to publish equal pay reporting and data, and we are currently working with the Welsh Government to look at the possibilities of attaching conditionality to any future economic resilience support grants that are provided to businesses and organisations, and that we are explicit in taking steps to close gender pay gap inequality. Additionally, we're also in the process of developing a race equality action plan, which will include the need to address the race pay gap. Now, as far as tackling the gender pay gap is concerned, this is nothing new for trade union reps and officers. As mentioned in the earlier part of this session, we see this practice across Europe and here in Wales too. And trade unions are quite often at the forefront of equal pay campaigns and tackling the gender pay gap, and have been for many years. And you will be able to see through the TUC website the range of different campaigns that we've been involved in as far as collective bargaining and using that as a means to sort of narrow the gap. But just to sort of end, what are the types of improvement that we believe as the TUC, what are we sort of calling for? Well, I think simply publishing gender pay gaps isn't enough. Companies must be required to explain what steps they're going to now take to close those gender pay gaps. And bosses who don't comply with the law should be fined. We need to have practical and deliverable action plans and narratives published alongside the pay gap figures. Also, as far as the extension of the requirement to cover more workers, again, employers with more than 50 workers should be required to publish their gender pay gap. And also, we want employers to publish their retention rates of women, following a period of maternity leave for 2 years. We know that's where this can become a massive issue. Motherhood is when the pay gap really begins to widen for women. And now, of course, we are very much at the cusp of a global recession. And here in particular, and across the globe in many respects, we've had years of austerity and cuts. And again, it's been women that have been hit the hardest. And then finally, just to sort of mention that ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting, again, the gender pay gap is shaped by other aspects of intersecting identities, and we can't close the gender pay gap without targeting racial inequalities and those experienced by disabled workers too. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I'm going to turn now to Sarah Gadd, who is a partner at Latham & Watkins, which provided much assistance, pro bono assistance, for which we're all very grateful on this research project. Sarah specialises in employment law, human resources issues, benefits and incentives, including share-based incentives. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for this great opportunity. We really enjoyed at Latham getting stuck into the detail on this report. It was a huge comparative exercise for us, and it was fascinating to learn how they did in other countries and take a comparative look at that as well. It's an area I'm very interested in. I'm a working mum, and I'm saying that in case my 3-year-old bursts into the room, so you're all ready for that, because obviously we're working from home right now. I think from a legal perspective, when these rules first came in, our first thought was, oh, there's going to be a lot more equal pay litigation once this reporting comes in. And what we've found is that hasn't necessarily followed, and that is partly because the information that companies are required to disclose in a gender pay gap report is very different to what a woman needs to bring an equal pay claim, because then essentially the information that's disclosed doesn't talk about equal pay for equal work. And just from a legal perspective, that's very interesting, because we then end up with sort of two regimes working towards the same objective, but not quite overlapping. And I think a lot of what we found in this comparative exercise was that other countries do require more detailed reporting. And with that detail, I think some of the data becomes more meaningful. When we talk to clients about their gender pay gaps and what to do and how to disclose, often what we end up doing is agreeing that they're going to disclose more than they're legally required to do to make a bit more sense of the data that's there, because sometimes the figures are very stark, sometimes they mask problems, but sometimes actually they mask things that are going well for them. And a lot of companies actually choose to over disclose here because they need to explain what these numbers mean. And I think that's really interesting. Questions come up in the Q&A. If you were to start again, what would you do? And probably on the basis of this report and that experience with clients, you'd look at a more detailed disclosure requirements so that the information can be more meaningful. The other way that I would look at this, something I do a lot of, is advise listed companies on their remuneration reporting for directors. We look at sort of CEO to workforce pay gaps and that kind of thing. And another difference in the legislation there is that they're required to report year-on-year differences, and they have to say it was this last year and it's this year. And trust me, that can be really difficult, and that really focuses minds in terms of, are we telling a positive story here or are we not? And I've spoken to clients whose gender pay gaps are diminishing and they're pleased and things are going well, but they say, well, we're not going to voluntarily disclose that because what if it goes the other way next year? So I think there's so much that could be done in these rules to make them a little bit punchier and to really help companies focus. And I love Gillian's comment about women not being broken. A lot of clients we speak to do choose to disclose action plans. They disclose what they're doing. They tell us about their initiatives. And in advance of this call, I spoke to our HR team and said, you know, what are our best initiatives? And actually, we think the best thing we've done lately is introduce a really generous paternity leave policy. And we think that and making men take some time off is actually, within our firm, turning out to be a really great one for levelling the playing field, because it's not just women like me who've had time off in our careers. And I think looking at the problem holistically has been fascinating for us. And I'll pass it back to Julia.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to call now on our final panellist, Andrew Baisley, who is the Policy Insight and Public Affairs Manager at the Fawcett Society. He's been there since 2016 and works across the breadth of gender equality issues. And of course, the Fawcett Society has been absolutely involved with the work that we're presenting in this webinar. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. As a number of our panelists have remarked already, these aren't normal times. We are very much at a crossroads in so many ways as a nation, as a planet, but in particular when it comes to gender equality. And what I think the gender reporting requirements that we have here and in other countries recognise is that we all have a role to play when it comes to tackling the gender pay gap. We already know the data at a national level. What the reporting does is asks individual employers to look at themselves, to look at their own practice and consider what it is that they could do to reduce the pay gap within their own space. And I think the crossroads that we're at raises the necessity of doing that, and raises the importance of requiring those employers to take action. That's clearly the thing that comes for me through from this report, is that a requirement to take action as a result of looking at that gender pay gap data is pretty consistent in other nations and isn't present in the UK, with the specific exception of the Welsh public sector. I'm going to say a little bit about about that crossroads that we're at and how it relates specifically to business, and then I'm going to say a bit about how, as the Fawcett Society, we're campaigning for some of the changes that this report, I think, sort of points towards, and potentially what those listening can do to be involved if they would like to. So just thinking about that crossroads, the sort of scale of loss and tragedy as a result of coronavirus is pretty unimaginable. 1 in 1,000 people in England and Wales have died as a result of it. Redundancies have seen the highest spike since records began. When we look at the crises, at sort of disasters like this in history, often they present as forks in the road of history, and I think that that's certainly the case here. In the ways that we try to adapt our way of lives to protect the NHS, save lives, we've seen changes happen which have been previously unimaginable within our workplaces. So around half of us worked from home for a significant chunk of this year, when previously we might have been told that working from home was an unachievable, unrealistic prospect within our workplace. For example, not all of those changes have been positive. I mean, working mothers are 1.5 times more likely to have lost work over the course of the pandemic, according to the IFS, than working fathers are. So from a gender equality perspective, these are not all necessarily positive changes. There's the possibility of a much more future-looking move towards more remote working, which could bring benefits. There's the possibility of us slipping back into 1950s gender roles in the household. As well as these changes, there's a huge challenge that's about to land on us as the furlough scheme starts to lift, as the reality of the damage to our economy becomes clear. And unlike in previous recessions where the immediate hit to employment, the immediate, not the long-term hit to employment, has been primarily focused on men, this time around there's very clear signals that that's not going to be the case. So there's another sort of challenge there for employers of what are you going to do to ensure that impact doesn't fall worst on women. So there are clear roles for businesses to play there in terms of the way that they take up the opportunities to build a more future-looking, a more forward-looking workplace, and the ways that they can counteract some of those challenges. They clearly have a role to play. At present, we don't require them to take any action, and that's where this report clearly points to an opportunity for change in requiring businesses to set out action plans as part of their gender pay gap reporting. Just to say a little about what the Fawcett Society is currently doing that might seek to take this agenda forward. Towards the end of the report, you can see that we have laid in the House of Lords at the beginning of this year with Baroness Prosser a Equal Pay Bill 2020, 50 years on from the original Equal Pay Act. That bill has a number of elements, but a key part of it is looking at gender pay gap reporting and asking what we can do to go further. So our recommendations in that bill are around action plans. They are around reducing the thresholds so that more employers do have to report, putting us more in line with international comparators. And they do include introducing an intersectional element into the reporting as well. That bill is going to be read in the House of Commons as a 10-minute rule bill on the 20th of October, so next week, by Stella Creasy MP. And we would strongly encourage you to get in touch with your local Member of Parliament and ask them to if they will support the bill. It's interesting that we've also in the discussion so far mentioned the gender pay gap and equal pay approach different issues, and that the data from gender pay gap reporting isn't quite enough to take an equal pay case. Introducing right to transparency that would give women the information they need to know whether they are being discriminated against is also a key part of that that bill as drafted currently. So please do have a look at the bill as it's currently drafted. Get in touch with your MP. I'm happy to share details about how people can do that with attendees afterwards, because there is an opportunity at this, at this 50-year anniversary, at this crossroads, to push for improved reporting and improved transparency and greater gender equality.
Thank you very much. I've been keeping my eye on the questions which are coming in thick and fast, and I'm just going to put a few of them now to the panel. Gillian, if I could just put one factual question to you. There is a question: what actions have been taken against employers who failed to report in previous years?
Well, the Equality and Human Rights Commission are responsible for enforcing the regulations, and for anybody who doesn't report, as well as anybody who reports any data that looks inaccurate as well. And they have followed up. They immediately write a threatening letter to all employers immediately after the deadline, and that tends to get employers to report quite quickly. And then they have the small subset that don't report, they've continued on to encourage them to report. I think the furthest along the proceedings they've got is an administrative agreement with the company, but ultimately, if the company then failed to report after this administrative agreement, they could eventually take them to court, and they could be liable for a fine if they weren't to report. But actually, the findings have been that on the whole, it's because employers have been a bit clueless that they've not been able to report, or sadly the company has gone out of business or changed hands, and so it's fallen between the cracks. But they've not come across any deliberate trying to avoid the regulations in those that haven't reported yet.
Thank you. If I was looking at the questions that came in before we started, there were some questions filed before and the questions that are coming in now. There's really two themes, I think. There's a lot of interest in how we improve the gender gap reporting regime post-COVID, a lot of interest in what COVID means for the gender pay gap, what are the positives and what are the negatives, and the panels discuss some of them, but also a lot of interest too on what all of this means, and it was a question posed by Laura at the start, what all of this means when we take an intersectional lens. What does it mean for Black women? What does it mean more broadly than looking at the question of gender, and how can we build out the regime that way? So I do want to come to each of those questions. I mean, I'll just do a sort of a call of the board. Gillian, I appreciate you may not be able to make a comment here, but there's a question which basically says, if you had the ability to pick which factors should be included in the transparency disclosure regime from here on in, so, from 2021 on, what would you pick? Could I do a quick call of the panel to see what people's answer to that would be?
I'm happy to go first on that one. One thing that jumped out at me that was very interesting that the French require is they require you to report on how many women were promoted last year. And I think that's a fascinating statistic, because I think a lot of the information we get is comparing women in junior roles to men in senior roles, and that's what skews the numbers. But if there was a sort of hard requirement to sort of report a bit more on promotions, that would be really interesting.
Thank you.
I think that we sometimes employers have a bit of a get out clause when it comes to equal pay reporting, because as Sarah's just said, it's quite limited and quite sort of stringent in terms of what they should be reporting on. And when we ask questions around ethnicity and disability, quite often they'll say, well, we just don't have that data, we just don't collect it, it's not a requirement. So I think that until we actually make those a requirement and they form part of the data that is sought, I can't see much changing. So those are the types of things that I'd want to see happening. I think that's the only way that we can actually address intersectional inequality.
Thank you. Andrew.
So I suppose I'd answer this question by going back to the purpose of gender pay gap reporting, which is to provoke employers into taking action to reduce the gender pay gap within their organisation. And so I think that the sort of headline figures, a bit of greater detail in those so that they can be a little more informative is really valuable. But I think that requirement to share information about what you are actually doing I would keep coming back to that as the thing that will make the greatest difference, because at the moment around half of employers publish any kind of action plan, and the proportion who publish, from this is fairly anecdotal, but from having had a look through some of the action plans, the proportion who publish a good action plan which will actually looks like it will make a difference is, I would say, substantially lower than that. So I think that there is that sort of change in would, I think, have the greatest impact. I do think the requirement to have intersectional data is also key, because it expands the sort of the validity of the information for more people for whom they don't really see their identity reflected in the data as it currently stands.
And we are getting this theme of questions around not just what can we do to improve the data, but what substantively can be done as we build the post-COVID economy. And I'm going to throw that to the panel. I mean, there are a few themes here that people are interested in. They're interested in it generally, but when we break out the themes, have we learned something about the value of caring work that we needed to know as a result of the pandemic? And will we be valuing that work better in the future? And obviously, if the monetary value of that work was reevaluated, that would make a difference to the gender pay gap, because it's predominantly women's jobs. So that's a theme. A second theme that's come through is, have we learned, and Andrew, I think you raised this, have we learned some things about virtual work that we can put into working practices, which means that it's more flexible, better for work and family life, potentially a more rigorous definition of merit, and that would potentially make a difference for women's jobs too. There's those themes in the discussion. Also, have we learned a lesson we needed to learn about the perils of casualised and insecure work, which, as we know, is predominantly women's work as well. So there's a few areas there. There may be some others on your mind, but once again, what do people think are the main things that we need to address in, Gillian used the phrase originally, build back better, and I think that's been a lot on people's minds as we try and build the economy back better. What are the key issues to keep our eyes on, the key levers for change that could enable us to build an economy that lessens the gender pay gap? I'm happy to take any contribution on that.
I'm happy to kick off on that. Certainly, sure. The point that Andrew raised around working remotely, and we do work very closely with business, and a lot of the business people that we talk to have just come back to us saying, well, why do we spend all this money on expensive office space in London when actually our members of staff are more productive working from home, wherever that is, not only in the UK but overseas as well. And so we are we've already been trying to push that as a way of not assuming that people have to be in the office 9 to 5 to be productive. And certainly that's something that we in GEO and across government are looking to try and build on, is that seeing what the actual benefits are of working flexibly and for everyone, because that's not just women that benefit from that. There are so many people that are seeing the benefits of working from home. The main thing that I think will be the benefit from the gender pay gap perspective is that before, flexible working was seen as a woman's thing, and it had this kind of tacit attachment to it that it's a woman's thing and she's stepping back from her career a bit. Whereas now, hopefully, more people will see actually it's not a bad thing. It can be more productive, and it's a good thing for everyone to do, not just a woman's thing. And so that's what we're hoping to push as part of our work.
Thank you. Happy to take any. Sarah, please.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I think it's very relevant in a sort of white collar environment. And we, you know, those of us working in law firms have felt that already. It's no longer only the working mums who are working from home, and that's a great leveler. I think sort of stepping a bit more widely than that, it's going to be really interesting to see the reporting figures next year and what COVID has meant. Are we going to see fewer employers having to report because redundancies mean fewer people have 250 employees? Are we going to see a reduction in bonuses overall? And given for a lot of companies, bonus data showed a bigger disparity. Is that going to mean a smaller disparity? But then does that necessarily mean the gender pay gap is reducing, or just no one got a bonus this year because targets weren't hit? So I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating, just sticking to the sort of gender pay gap data, what we see coming out of COVID. And I'm really interested to see what the numbers look like next year.
I think that, sorry, yeah, just to add to that, so Welsh Government have set themselves a target of a 30%, a 30% of the population in Wales to continue working from home wherever that is possible. And during COVID, they that was the line. If you can work from home, you should continue to work from home. And they've been quite consistent in that. I think that the fact of the matter is, as Sarah's just mentioned, they are those workers who can work from home, but there are a number of workers who can't work from home. There's a number of jobs that can't be done from home, and that's where we do see a number of women workers. So particularly in sort of retail and some of the other sectors that I previously mentioned when I spoke. And additionally, in terms of some of our concerns, I guess, really, as trade unions have been, that if we move away from this idea of this sort of the big offices, so to speak, there are a number of people, particularly women, who do work in those environments who can't do their jobs from home. But additionally, if women are working from home, we also need to be quite flexible in terms of the hours that they work, because particularly if you've got children at home and you've got young children, a lot of childcare provision hasn't reopened fully for younger children, and women have been doing the juggling act. And I think this goes back to some of the points that Andrew made about, in some sort of way, we could potentially end up going backwards, and this idea that it is the woman's job to sort of manage everything at home as well as sort of work. But there have been some concerns raised by women in that for those who have been able to work flexibly, that a lot of the meetings, etc., tend to take place during the day. They are then not able to log in onto these meetings. A lot of their male colleagues are able to. And sometimes it is about seeing is believing. And there's some real concerns about potential promotion opportunities and what does that look like. And in terms of COVID and our recovery plan, again, where for those types of jobs that are, in sectors that have been hit, that are possibly not going to recover, what happens to those workers, and which areas are they going to, where are those jobs going to come from, and how can we then upskill and reskill, particularly women who have already got, a range of different equalities facing them. How can we protect their interests, but also ensure that they are featured very heavily as far as that recovery is concerned? There's a lot of, we always talk about projects that we can get moving on already, shovel-ready projects often gets mentioned, but where do women feature in these shovel-ready job? What does that actually mean for women? So sometimes I think it's also about the terminology that's used, and some of these decisions are taken by older white men, straight white men, who have a sort of sometimes a bit of a tunnel vision. So I think that in some of these recovery plans, we do need to be ensuring that these intersectional voices are at those decision-making tables as well.
Thank you, Andrew.
Just one, so throughout the pandemic, we've been receiving sort of weekly diaries from a group of women who signed up to do so with us. Just in relation to flexible work, I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from them. So one woman wrote in saying, "My husband is the higher earner, and the perception is that my work can be more flexible, so I shoulder the homeschooling. I would have appreciated more of an equal split in homeschooling responsibility. I prepare all the meals and do all the bath time and bedtime routine." And another woman wrote in to say, "So I sit opposite my son at the dining table while I'm working. My husband works in the study, so homeschooling really falls to me. We've recently agreed that I can use the study sometimes if I've got meetings." So I think that the assumption that flexible working will necessarily by default mean greater gender equality sort of needs to be questioned. I think that inarguably there is a real potential benefit to more people, not just more women, but more people doing more flexible work. We do know over the course of the pandemic, while women ended up doing a lot more childcare, men also ended up doing a lot more childcare. And I think among younger fathers particularly, I'm a new one myself, and a lot of my friends are as well, there is a increased interest in a better work-life balance coming out of the COVID pandemic as well. So I think that these things can all have huge positive effects on the gender pay gap if we do them right. And if businesses are putting the work into thinking, how can we properly involve people who are working remotely in all of the right sort of decisions and opportunities within our business? How do we make sure that they are not facing greater risks of redundancy when those prospects come forward over the coming months? Then we can potentially do some of that well. Just on the point around caring and are we going to better value caring roles, and will that help close the gender pay gap? I think that's a decision. That's very much a political decision. For the most part, our caring roles are paid for by government. 2/3 of adults and social care is paid for by the government in one way or another, and a really significant proportion of childcare is as well. So if we want those caring roles to be valued better, the government needs to take a decision to raise taxes, probably not increase borrowing, but and use that money to fund a better settlement for those workers. Ideally, to fund a better settlement for those who use it as well, create and offer more of it free at the point of use. Our polling shows that there's significant support even for tax raising measures among the public to achieve that.
There is huge appetite in the questions. There's certainly concern that gender pay reporting comes back next year and that it comes back bigger than better. There's an appetite to see a public consultation help shape what that bigger and better would be. There's certainly an appetite for that data to be disaggregated so that we could get to grips with intersectionality and other factors that are at work. And there's an appetite to understand, what works. And Gillian, you referred to the Equalities Office putting together guidance about what works, but there's also an appetite for more guidance around what might make a difference when we're bringing the intersectional lens, what could make a difference if we're not only considering gender, but also considering disparities based on race. We are in the final few minutes now, so I feel like probably I need to go round the panel for last observations, but if any last observations you've got can pick up threads from where the concerns are on the chat line and the question line, that would be very useful. So I'll take it from the top. Gillian, is there any last words from you?
I think reassurance. I know there's a lot of people who are concerned that the pandemic has thrown equalities out of the window, but I can absolutely assure you that there are a huge number of people working across government on this. It's just trying to narrow down what we can do and balance the burden that we put on business in working on this versus government and all of those really complicated questions that we're answering at the moment. But we are definitely taking action, and there will be announcements shortly on what we're doing.
Okay, you heard it here first. Announcements shortly on what we're doing. Shavana.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to the point that simply publishing gender pay gaps just isn't enough. companies have got to be required to explain what steps they're going to take to close those gaps, and bosses who don't comply with the law, they should be fined. We've got to get to a point of practical and deliverable action plans and narratives that are published alongside the pay gap figure. I think that if this is going to happen, it has to happen now. People need to actually see that it is going to be taken seriously, particularly because this recession that we are currently facing is going to be like of a scale that we've never, faced, surely, definitely not in my lifetime, and nothing like our previous recession. So if this is going to be equitable and just in terms of what we do next and a better recovery, then we've got to get it right from the offset. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sarah.
Thanks. I would just say that we learned a lot pulling this report together. We learned what other countries do. There were some great ideas in there. I hope that the report will be read and people will take some inspiration from that. I think there are other areas of reporting that you can look at as well, whether it's public company reporting. The overwhelming thing I thought would make a difference is if there was some sort of comparison year on year that employers are required to stand up to. And which employees can look at and take comfort and spot the best employers, because the market will move as well. I think employees, especially younger people, want to work for progressive employers that care about this kind of thing. And there's a great opportunity here to do that.
Thank you. Andrew.
So I'll just finish on a point around this idea of what works to improve gender equality. I think there's a lot of kind of small tweaks that employers can make, which would make a big difference. Blind interviewing when it comes to selecting candidates, having more structured progression procedures, having more gender equal panels for hiring and promotion. There's also bigger things which don't necessarily come through in that kind of what works approach, like paying your lowest paid workers, who are more likely to be women, better. And I think that those kinds of things should be what employers are looking at as well, albeit in very straitened times for them.
Thank you very much. Can I say a very big thank you to our panellists, also to Antonio and to Laura for bringing us into this session and conveying this work to us. I would commend the research to people. Please have a very good look at it. It is late at night in Australia. It's 11:30 p.m. where I am, but despite the late hour, I always find these webinar sessions very energising, a lot to learn because of the quality of the contribution. So thank you very much to our panellists. Thank you to everybody who's joined us in the audience and has been so interactive on our question and answer line. This is not only energising for me, it's a great way for me to see friends, at least in some ways, over in London, given I can't get there personally. So a big hello to Karen in particular, who's on the line, and let me know that she would be on the line. Thank you to each of you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future session for the Global Institute